Okay, the title of this talk is about MOOCs, but in fact, the talk is broader than that. But why don't we start off by explaining what the word MOOC means, just in case there are people that haven't heard of it. It stands for Massive Open Online Courseware. And all four words are important. Massive in the sense that there are lots and lots of people that can listen to one course. Open in the sense that it's true open software. Everybody can get in. It's not licensed in the sense that that you can grab that data. Although I suspect that the people who are developing the courses, and Charlie can tell us that later, probably do license their stuff. Online, well, that's obvious, and C is courseware. So the first thing that I did when I was going to put this course together is to start thinking about where education came from, because I really had absolutely no idea. And I found out that the first universities were back about 1,000 years ago. And then I learned some very interesting things. One of the things I found out is when Gutenberg developed printing, it became threatening to teachers. Because it used to be that if you wanted to learn something, you had to go to the teacher, and the teacher would give you his or her, well, back then I'm so sure it was all his knowledge. All of a sudden there were books. And with books, maybe you didn't need teachers anymore. And we'll get into that subject a little bit later when we start talking about what MOOCs make available. Well, I decided I'd find out a little bit more about textbooks because about a year ago, I was going to help my granddaughter with a math course. And I said, well, I'll just buy the book that you have. And then even though you're 1,000 miles away, I can look at the book. So I went to Amazon to find a used copy of the book, and it was $200. So I quickly decided that that was not a good way to deal with my granddaughter. But then I started looking into renting books. And I'm not going to go through the material because I've got it on this page, but it's interesting that you can, in fact, rent books. And you can rent them for short periods of time or longer periods of time, and therefore not have to do what all of us did back in school, of buying the books. So let's talk about today. What I want to go through is the various ways to acquire education, mostly online in one way or another. And of course, there are some brick and mortar opportunities that have changed considerably over the last 3 months, and I'll get into that in a moment. What I found when I retired is that I wanted to get as much education as I could. That's why I joined the group that we're part of now. And I found out sometimes I had a whole heap of time that I could spend doing something, and sometimes I only had a few minutes. And one of the things that I threw on this page is that there are sites out there, and I'd recommend that most of you sign up for Big Think. They send out some very interesting things. TED Talks, which we'll get to on page 37. Are a really nice way of spending 10 to 15 minutes. There are tons of good lectures out there. And one of my favorites is the Kennedy Library, which we'll get to a little bit later. And then obviously, if you have a lot of time, then there are courses out there. So let's talk about what kinds of things are in fact available through universities and towns. I'm involved, as is Peter Albin, and probably some other people in this group. Joel Schwimmer is involved in lifelong learning programs. Many of them, not all of them, are partially funded by a man by the name of Bernard Osher, who, starting back almost 20 years ago, put money towards the development of lifetime learning courses for mostly retirees. It's not exclusively, but most of the people who participate are retirees. There are over 120. I didn't check to see what the current number is. In Massachusetts, there's one at Tufts, one at Brandeis, one at UMass. Maybe there are only 3. Anyway, and these programs generally are modest cost, depending on your definition of modest. They're peer taught, and I'll go into some of the details of some of them. They don't have tests, they don't have papers, they don't have grades, although I did stumble across 1 or 2 OSHA courses that do in fact have grades. The Brandeis one is the one that I'm heavily involved in, and it was kicked off with something like $1 million back 20 years ago. And periodically they get some additional money if they ask very nicely. So I noted on here the 3 that I'm aware of and the links that get you to those 3. So let's just talk about the Brandeis one for a moment. There are about 50 courses per semester. They're either 10 weeks long or 5 weeks long. We've got about 500 members. When you sign up for it, which costs about $700 a year, you get a couple of courses per semester. You get courses during the summer. You get courses during intersession. You've got all sorts of affinity groups, book clubs, and other things, and they're all part of that fee. When I say that they're group-led, what I mean is that about 95% of the classes are led by one of those 500 members. Sometimes it's a member who knows a lot about the subject because that's what they did in their working life. In other cases, it's just somebody who's interested in an area and learned a lot about it so they could lead a course. Not much different than what some of us do in teaching sessions here. Brandeis has gone totally Zoom as of March, I think it was March 14th. The first 2 weeks of the spring semester was at Turner Street in Waltham. That was shut down by mid-March. It's all Zoom. The lectures are Zoom. The Distinguished Speaker Series, which I run, is Zoom. And although it took some weeks to get going, much like us, by the time it was going for 4 or 5 weeks, all the participants and all the study group leaders were comfortable with it, and it was working well. And the plan for the fall is 100% Zoom. UMass Boston has a similar program. I'm not going to go through the details here, but if you looked through it, you'd see that at first level approximation, it's pretty similar. And I thought I had a page on Tufts. Maybe I don't. There are a variety of programs that are college run that are not sponsored by OSHA. And here are ones that I happen to know a little bit about. And they're all also somewhat similar to what I described for the Bali one. Joel Schwimmer, who's on the call, has been active with LAAC for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, I think. So if anybody's interested in that, they can contact him. Peter Albin is involved both at Tufts and at Brandeis. So there are a lot of people who you probably know that are involved with these systems. Huh. Doesn't want me to go to the next page. Maybe because I keep on getting these emails. Okay, there it is. Then there are lots of other places that offer courses other than universities. And everybody on this call probably is aware that the town of Lexington offers courses. I put together this page before Charlie signed up to sign an atom bomb course that he's doing 5 or 6 sessions coming up. When is it, Charlie? In the fall?
July 6th, week from next Monday, I start.
Okay, so those people who want more knowledge on the subject than you got from the 2 sessions that Charlie gave for this group, it's available there. And there are a variety of other courses that are available. And until the pandemic, these were all taught at the community center. And now, of course, they're all being taught online with Zoom. And then there are lots of other places that are offering courses. The Cambridge Center for Adult Education is an interesting place. Joel and I and our spouses took a couple of courses there on music. We took a course on Gershwin and a course on Irving Berlin and Rodgers and Hammerstein. And anyway, there are courses at reasonable rates. It's a bit of an aggravation to get into the center in the middle of Cambridge. I haven't checked. I'm guessing that those are available by Zoom today. And then there are other colleges that have decided at one point or another in their career that they have courses that are not fully subscribed by their paying membership. And I first learned about this maybe 8 years ago, where Wellesley College was offering courses. I don't remember if they charged for it, but people could audit a class if there was availability. And then a few months later, I heard that they changed it so you could only do that if you were a Wellesley resident, which I wasn't. But in the meantime, I then heard about Merrimack and Lowell, and this date is a little bit old, so I haven't verified whether or not it's still true. But at the time, you could audit courses there. And at varying times, I believe Boston University, and Steve may be able to clarify this, I believe Boston University also had a similar program. But more and more colleges are realizing that when courses are not entirely full, there's an opportunity to make some of those slots available to others, either at a charge or not, and usually just as an auditor, so you don't tie up teacher time, but at least you have a full class. So now, let's move over to MOOCs. Now, the first MOOC that I became aware of was from Stanford, and it was a course on artificial intelligence. And I thought, boy, this is something I'd really like to understand more about. Keep in mind that this was 8-9 years ago, so we knew a lot less about it than we know today. And I assumed that I was going to learn about how companies like Amazon and others used AI in their business. So I signed up for the course. The course was free. And what I found within a couple of weeks of lectures was that this was not a practical AI class, although on occasion they got into some of that. Mostly it was a course in math. And although if I worked hard enough and brought back what I knew back in 1967, I could do the math, that really wasn't what I wanted to do. So after about 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the course, I pseudo dropped out. What I meant is that I stopped doing the homework and I listened to the lectures in the hopes that I would learn something that I wanted to learn. Most of these MOOCs, this one and others, don't have prerequisites. Anybody can sign up. Many of them have a schedule associated with them. In other words, the course will begin on a particular date, and then those lectures are available online from that point until some endpoint. Some classes actually don't have an endpoint, but in general, there's an endpoint that might be a few months after the last class is posted, and not surprisingly, you can take any given lesson whenever you want to do it. You can break it into chunks. You can take a lesson 2 or 3 times. If you don't understand it, you can do it at 3 a.m. in the morning, it doesn't matter. Almost all of these MOOCs have quizzes. That data, I suspect, is mostly used by the people running the MOOC to try to determine whether or not the folks are truly understanding it. And I would like to think that they modify their teaching based on the result of the quizzes. But it also helped me understand that I wasn't understanding a lot of this stuff. I was getting too many wrong math answers. Now, here's the part that's a little bit surprising. The AI class ended, and although I don't have really, really good data, I was told that only 5 to 10% of the people finished the class. So my first thought was, well, that's awful. 5% finishing a class. But it turned out that 100,000 people signed up for the class. So if 5% finished and you had 5,000 people that took this class, that's pretty impressive. And so I would call that good, even though I'm sure that the instructors, the professors for the class, were unhappy that a smaller percentage passed. Now, that was because that particular class was very rigorous and very hard. And the kinds of people that they were looking for in the class were the kinds of people who were juniors and seniors at Stanford with lots of math behind them. And what many of these MOOCs have learned over the last number of years is that the student body that they had anticipated turned out not to be what they in fact got. And a very large number of people taking these MOOCs are not 27-year-old Raytheon employees trying to learn Python because it'll help them with their career. They're retirees who want to learn something. Now, 3 days ago, I met a young man who had just graduated college. And I asked him what it was like trying to get a job right now. And he said, awful. And I said, what did you major in? He said, sociology. And I couldn't help myself. I went, oh. And he started laughing and said, yeah, you're right, that's a problem. So I suggested to him that he should look into MOOCs. And he said, what's a MOOC? So I not only told him what a MOOC was, I invited him to this talk. I have no idea whether he's on, I haven't checked. But basically what I said to him was that if he wanted to expand his background so that when he goes in for an interview, he can say, yeah, I majored in sociology, but I've also taken courses in A, B, C, D, and E, and that demonstrates my interest in learning and demonstrates my breadth of understanding. I said, MOOCs is a great way to do it. And he asked me, well, how do you go do that? And I said, well, come listen to the talk, but there are a number of large organizations out there. The 4 large ones are Coursera, Udacity, EdX, and Canvas that provide courses. I haven't tried to add up how many courses they provide. I would guess it's probably 4,000, 5,000. So there are some organizations that have looked at the different programs and tried to contrast how they operate. And when you look at this chart, and I'm not going to spend more than 30 seconds here, what you see is that there are some organizations like Coursera that are very broad in the areas that they cover with their courses. And there are others that are not nearly as broad in what they cover. But you can go Google and look for a particular subject, do MOOC, DNA, and you'll find where all the DNA courses are. So let's just quickly go through a few of them. And again, I'm not going to go through all the details. You've got it on the chart. There's the URL for Coursera. There are 118 different universities that participate with them. and they've got a broad range of courses. Most of them are taught in English. In the beginning, everything was English, but over the last number of years, MOOCs have broadened, and you can see from this, there are 122 courses in Chinese. The courses have varying duration. This chart is a little bit old, but I just threw up a couple of courses on here so you can get a sense for how these things work. And they give the dates when they begin, and you can click on the course and they can give you a lot more data about what it is. EdX is an organization that initially started with MIT, Harvard, and Berkeley. It's since expanded enormously, and they have a lot of courses out there. I've taken a bunch of courses through EdX. I took the basic MIT biology, what we would have called 701, very hard course, but I learned a lot of biology and I learned a lot about DNA. I took a Harvard course called The Science of Cooking. That was fascinating, particularly the home assignments, which were baking. Made some good chocolate, or chocolate products. I took 3 Civil War courses by a guy named Foner from Columbia. It was 3 courses because it was one pre-Civil War, the causes of the Civil War, the second one on the war, and the third one on Reconstruction. The basic MIT physics courses. For those of you who are MIT people, that's basically the 801, 802, and maybe 803 and 4, I don't recall, MIT courses. Charlie probably knows. So there are lots of courses out there through EdX, and there's a famous story that I've heard, I believe it's true, about a kid from Mongolia who took MOOCs, and as a result of taking all the courses, got accepted into MIT. That was a story I heard about 5 years ago. I believe it's true. It's a good story, whether it is or isn't. So here are a lot of the EdX courses. Michael Sandel has an excellent course on justice that I took. I've taken about 20 MOOCs, I would say. And there's some things that have begun to arise in the last couple of years that are different. I have heard now of 2 places, Carnegie Mellon and this EdX class, where you can actually buy an online degree. Now, when I say buy it, I mean you have to do the work and you have to write the papers and do the tests and all the rest, but it's fully online. Now, this was all done before the pandemic, but of course, all the schools are teaching all their courses now online, and I suspect that 3 or 4 years from now, the whole education paradigm for coursework is going to be very, very different. And I don't know if we have time later on or maybe another day, we could probably talk about that. Udacity is another one. I'm not sure if that's the way you pronounce it, but they've got a wide variety of courses out there, including a bunch of technical courses. I stuck 3 of them out there just sort of to demonstrate to you guys that there were in fact those kinds of courses, and they defined them as beginner, intermediate, or advanced. I don't believe that they require that you take some test to get into the advanced one, but at least they gave an indication of the difficulty of the class. I know back when I was at work, I would frequently tell people who complained that, you know, how come I kept them on a Fortran job? And I would say that's because you know Fortran and you haven't yet learned Pascal or whatever the new language was at the time. And they'd say, well, how could I learn that? And I'd say, well, go to an evening class at, buy a book and go to an evening class at Northeastern or BU or someplace else that has them. Well, of course, today the answer to that question would be totally different. I'd say go utilize one of the MOOCs out there, and there are lots of them, and it's probably hard to find a subject that you can't find a MOOC on. So prior to that one that I mentioned earlier out of MIT, Georgia Tech announced a master's degree. That came out a couple of years ago. Canvas is another one. I don't believe I ever took a course from Canvas. And then there are lots of other courses that lots of other universities have available, including some places that never occurred to me, like iTunes. I think of iTunes as a place to get music, but they have iTunes University, and they have lots of courses out there. University of Southern Queensland. You see, you don't have to go to Australia to take a course, but you could take a course on the introduction to tourism. So there are lots of other things out there. This is a place with a lot of useful business courses that I think are particularly good for somebody who's opening up a small business. They're opening up a bakery, they're opening up a restaurant, and they want to learn something about business law, business marketing, etc. I don't know how many people in this group know Jonathan Haber. He's a Lexington resident and very interesting guy. And he decided to find out whether or not he could acquire the equivalent of a 4-year BA degree in philosophy in 1 year through MOOCs. Take the courses, do all the work, do all the homework, write all the papers. And back in 2013, he did it. He put together a blog and a web page, and then he wrote a very interesting book that MIT published in 2014 that discussed how he did it. Now, he's an unusual guy, and he was willing to put a level of effort into this program that I don't think normal people would do. And I don't mean that in a derogative way. He's a very bright guy. He worked very hard, and he did this for a number of reasons, one of which was because he wanted to write the book. And he used this as a way to acquire knowledge to write the book and become a consultant. And after this, he actually took a job with MIT, with EdX. I don't know what he's doing currently. I don't know whether he's still with them. But he and I talked a few times, and as I said, his book was quite good. And then, of course, you can purchase courses or borrow them from the library. And we went through all this a couple of months ago when we had a talk from a Lexington librarian. So I don't think I really have to go through anything on this page. But I think that what was interesting from the context of this talk is that there are an enormous number of courses that are available through the libraries. There's a company called the Teaching Company that has about 500 courses. They're referred to as great courses. Back when I first started taking them, they were CDs and VCR tapes. Now they're DVDs. Judy and I had assumed that we were going to Egypt. Now, of course, with the pandemic, that's not going to happen in the near future. But in the meantime, she bought the Teaching Company Egypt course, which is a wonderful course of 48 half-hour lectures available on DVD. And we're taking the course anyway, even though at the moment it doesn't look like we're going to Egypt. And there are lots and lots of good courses there. And one of the interesting things that the Teaching Company did back pre-pandemic is that they would have events in various cities, Boston and others, and they would use this as a mechanism to talk about a particular subject and then talk about the link to the courses that they had in that area. And I provided a link down here at the bottom to that. I'm sure they're not doing it today. Maybe that will open up again. Now, I say that there are 500 or so great courses that you can go out and buy. The Minuteman library system, which consists of about 35 libraries, cumulatively has a couple of hundred of those courses. And the library has the ability usually to get courses from outside the Minuteman network. So most of those courses that you're interested in, you can find if you want them. You know, you have limitations to borrowing them for 3 weeks and then doing them for another 3 weeks, which may be an issue. There's also another organization called Modern Scholar. They're smaller than the other group. They've got about 175 courses, and many of them are also available through the libraries. And I listed a couple of them. Then some years ago, somebody asked me where they could find out some technical computer information, the kinds of things that we do in our sessions here. And I said, gee, I don't know. You know, I know about long courses and I know about some shorter things, but I poked around a little bit and I stumbled into lynda.com. And that's a site that I haven't personally used with all kinds of short classes. And if you were working and you wanted to improve your skill set, this seems like a modest cost way of doing that. And then, of course, there's Khan Academy. I think most of you have probably heard of Khan Academy, and most of you have probably gone to it. It was started back when Salman Khan put together a couple of videos for I don't recall whether it was a cousin or a nephew who was having some math problems, and he put together a video, and it helped the child, and then he put together more videos, and then he put together more videos, and I guess he found it to be so much fun that he retired as a hedge fund manager. And he formed Khan Academy, and there are thousands of courses there in a very, very broad domain, including test prep, which I had forgotten about until I just looked at this line that I had put together a little while ago. But I've got 2 grandchildren who just finished their junior year in high school. So I think I'll tell them about the Khan Academy, which is free, SAT test prep. Maybe they'll find that to be useful. And then, well, what else is out there? So there were a few other miscellaneous things that I found, one of which that I suspect that some of you know about to some extent is that there are lots of free books out on the internet. And I think when I first tried to learn about this, I assumed that there were hundreds of books, or maybe a couple of thousand books. What I had no idea of is that there were hundreds of thousands. And of course, a lot of that is because books are no longer covered by copyright once they get old. The classics, of course, are all past that date. And of course, as most of you who have library cards know, there are all sorts of ebooks that are available through the library and obviously through places like Amazon, Kindle, and all these other devices. And podcasts. I remember when podcasts first came out, and they were rare and unusual, and there were a couple of them, And now you can't take a step without stumbling across a podcast. I even write 2 of them for Brandeis. One of them on technology, where I steal stuff from this group, and one of them on cooking. I mentioned a couple of them here that I found to be particularly interesting, and some of you might be interested in looking at them. BBC has a lot of great stuff. Back a year or 2 ago, I showed, and then I think Peter Albin showed, a number of podcasts from the history of the world in 100 objects, the British Museum podcasts. These were short items. They're all available free. I did take the history of Rome 9 years ago. It's up to 100. Last I looked, it was up to 179 episodes. I gave up at about 90, but they were absolutely fascinating. Rome was something I always wanted to know something about. And then there's an organization called Stumbleupon, which I haven't used for a couple of years, but they've got a lot of members. You can become a member free. You define your areas of interest, and it sends you information with some regularity. And then I said I'd mention TED Talks, and I think everybody here in this group has seen TED Talks. We've shown probably at least a dozen of them at varying times at the group. But last I looked, there were 1,700 TED Talks that were out there. The ones that are not in English are subtitled in English. There are a lot of major corporate sponsors. I didn't list all of them, but big names. And I've taken a lot of them, and you can go search for TED Talks by a variety of criteria. What I tend to do is look on most viewed, because I figure if lots of people are looking at them, they're probably sufficiently interesting for me to look at them. But you can also limit them, as you can see by the center picture here, to science. You can show the ones that are recent. There are all sorts of criteria that you can use to find interesting material. And here are a number that I thought were particularly interesting, and so I just listed them on this page. Some of these are fairly old, and because they're fairly old, you can see the number of views is sometimes fairly high. The interesting one is note the Steve Jobs one. Back when I yanked it for this, there were 10 million views. Now, I don't know how a view is counted. I suspect that if you go to the TED Talk and then go back to it tomorrow, you're probably counted twice. But the bottom line is that if the number of views is in the millions, it's something that's probably pretty popular. And there are a lot of interesting things out there. And then for the few of you who might be interested, I tossed this in. There's a physics organization at the University of Michigan, and they put out a physics talk every week. And Charlie can mention it if he has the time, but he sent me a link to an MIT physics presentation that was actually done by a friend of mine who's a year behind me in school. And MIT puts talks out online. And of course, with the pandemic, a lot of these things are online that probably wouldn't have been 6 months ago. But now there's a lot of it. I even had a college reunion last month that was online. Whoops. One of my favorite things is the Kennedy Library Forum. I've gone to a whole bunch of their talks. I got re-interested in it about a month ago because there was something that I wanted to hear. And as a result, I've listened to 4 of their talks in the last month. It used to be that you had to drive to the forum and reserve a seat, but then turned out that they started recording them. And then the recordings were all put up in the archive. So nowadays, there's absolutely no need to drive into Dorchester to go to the forum, because you can see it in real time as it's being presented, or within 24 hours, you can listen to the copy of it that they've put up on the internet. And they've archived everything for the last 22, 23 years. There's a lot of very interesting stuff out there. And I only put up the YouTube one to give you a couple of statistics because it shocked the hell out of me. First of all, I found that from my son, who's posted some stuff and actually gets money on it. He gets a couple of $100 a month. But there's this guy, Ryan Kaji, who apparently has gotten millions from stuff that he posted on YouTube. 30 million users visit YouTube each day. 5 billion video hours watched each day. I watch a bunch of YouTube, but boy, it takes a lot of me to come up with these kinds of numbers. 300 hours of video uploaded every minute. It's really interesting how enormous this has become, and it was bought by Google. I don't remember the year. I think 3 or 4 years ago, by more than $1.5 billion. The Lexington veterans meet in Lexington every month. Well, almost every month. I think they meet 10 months a year. And they have talks which are recorded. Now they're Zoomed. And they have a lot of very interesting talks. This last one I went to just a couple of weeks ago. These were about gliders that were used in World War II. Very interesting talk. And the people who were in the gliders and bringing them down didn't have parachutes, which I found interesting. So that's the end. I promised Charlie that I would do this in under 45 minutes, so he would have 45 minutes. And it looks like I did it in 43. So there are lots of options available. And I saw Dave Kahn taking notes, I thought, but all this is available. Stephen, of course, has been recording it, and he'll post it, I assume, also. And as a result, if you want any of the data that's on the slides, it's there, and you can just link to it. You really didn't have to take notes of all this. So thank you very much. And I guess I have time for a question or two, but at 10:45, I want to turn it over to Charlie.
Can I ask a question? Maybe Charlie could participate in this. You mentioned that books were a threat to academics because they were no longer the repository of knowledge. Are videos just as much a threat to academics, in the sense right now everybody's recording them, but at some point, especially for static information like the history of the Civil War, you're going to have lots of videos having been recorded.
I went to a talk yesterday by Bob Metcalf, who's one of the founders of Ethernet and a whole bunch of other things. And that was one of the things he said explicitly in his talk. I will quote him as best as I can. Why do you need hundreds of excellent physics professors if you can record the lecture from the best one? And Charlie, as a physics professor, can probably address what that might be like 10 years from now.
Well, I'm going to give a little bit of a clue as to what I think is going to happen at the end of my talk. So I'm not going to give away my punchline now.
But Jerry, your point is an excellent one. And the reason that I mentioned how books were a threat to the early universities, what I meant to do when I said that was to say at the end how all this online is a threat to traditional universities.
Now, this was not anticipated when, going back to last week's class, when Curt Flood established free agency in baseball. It was thought that this would improve the salaries of, this alone would improve the salaries of all the players, which it probably did. But what they didn't anticipate was that the superstars would garner up most of the money, and that it really wasn't distributed in an even way. And I suspect if it's a threat to them, that the superstars will gather all the, whatever currency is important, whether it's academic currency or monetary currency, concentrate among the superstars.
You're probably right. Well, I think to be fair, let's turn this over to Charlie.
So I'm following John. That's a hard act to follow. And I'm going to skip over a number of things because John has done a good job, I think, of telling us about what is a MOOC. I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about some of the things that John talked about, but really from my point of view, because I've had a different sort of experience with MOOCs. My interest in MOOCs comes from some different sources than John's, although I think we have a lot of similarity in our views of what happens. So if I want to talk about what is a MOOC, John already did that. Let's see if, yeah. And this is a kind of nice slide that makes the point that he makes at the beginning, is that you have massive open online courses. And then it turns out that massive can have to do with, is 100 massive or is 100,000 massive? Is open registration, open content, is it free, is it affordable? John's opening slide has a message which I think is misleading. He says that free education is possible. And in one sense, he's right, at least at the moment. MOOCs let you take some things that for free from eminent professors and give you openings to academic material that you would never get otherwise. But they're not free. They may be free for you, but they turn out to be rather expensive to make. And I'm going to come back to that point later. The question of online is very nice. Are you going to have real-time interaction? Are you going to have it widespread, or are you going to have it sort of localized, like in training videos or training short courses for corporations and things like that? Is the course itself going to be self-paced? Is it going to have or start and end dates? Will it be college credits, badges, what's the role of the instructor? See, there's a remarkable lack of interaction. And in fact, the issue of a learning community is, I think, very important. There's an attempt to create learning communities among the people who have enrolled. It does not work very well, even when it's working at all. And then there's the problem of how does it get improved? John suggested that the instructors look at the quizzes and see what they have to improve in their course presentation. I don't think that there's much of that goes on. And in the big picture, you have this problem of what is the purpose of the MOOC? Are you trying to build some kind of an intellectual community with it? Or are you just trying to provide this stuff for a whole lot of people? So there's a kind of range of things there to talk about. So all of that is embedded in this word MOOC. Who makes MOOCs? John really went through that a little bit. I just point out that it's mostly elite educational institutions, and they are the producers of the material. But then this material is put together by outfits like Coursera or EdX, some of it is not very refined, not very distilled, like MIT's open Courseware. This business of, well, John pointed out there are now hundreds and hundreds of universities and colleges that are involved. But one of the reasons for that is that right from the start, EdX and to some extent Coursera also have had the problem, they do not have a business model. There is no viable plan for how they're going to have an income flow. In 2012, Harvard and MIT each put up $30 million, $60 million on the table to create EdX. And in effect, they have run through this, and now in facing the problem of where their income stream is going to come from for the future, they have gone out and recruited. I know that my own institution, Colgate, created for a while something called Colgate X. And to be part of the players, you had to put up around $500,000, which Colgate did once or twice, and then has dropped out of it, as have many other smaller sources of academic material. So there is this problem of, serious problem of a lack of a business model. So who takes MOOCs? John, again, gave you some insight into this, but I want to make a point using some old data. So this is showing you a couple of things. One is the gray bars show you enrollments in 802X, the electricity and magnetism course that's taken by all MIT freshmen. That was the first MIT course that went into edX. It was one of edX's earliest offerings. And it was possible because they had in the can at MIT the lectures of Walter Lewin, the physics lectures. These are very polished lectures and engaging lectures, but they had to be sort of adapted into the edX framework. In effect, edX had to produce a wrapper that went around the Lewin lectures and provided quizzes and insights of various kinds. And this turned out to be a very big job. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. But the other point I wanted to make is that the red bars are showing kind of what's going on overall with productions by MIT that are sent to edX. So MIT has a kind of production unit called MITx. They put together the courses, they put together the material, then they send it through edX, conform it to edX's standards and the software limitations that I'll mention again in a little while. So, but the point is that MITx and what happens in 802X are pretty nearly the same thing. Here you can see a little different. Oh, but the point I want to make here is that, yes, there are people in our age group out here taking the course, but the major segment of enrollees, at least in the early days, was in the 20 to 29-year-old group. But you can see that if you look at this distribution down here, this is age, really, versus percentage of registrations. And what you can see here is that that a surprising number of the people who are enrolling have already got their bachelor's degrees, their master's degrees, and their doctorate. This is substantially out of proportion to the enrollments. Here would be the ones who are just college students. They have completed their secondary education, and so and either not gone on to college or they're in college now. These less than secondary, that's where your what you say, iconic Mongolian wizard physics student was, because I think he was about 12 years old when he was discovered the first year that they were doing edX. And anyway, that story, as John says, true or not, is a good story, and it goes forward. But he would have been down here. We would be up in here, probably. And the point I want to make here that I think is implicit in these data is that it's experienced learners who are the primary market for MOOCs. And I think there's some important reasons for that, and they have to do with the limitations of the MOOC. The MOOC, I believe, is not appropriate for naive learners.
Charlie, does it make you uncomfortable that you can't see your audience, that you can't see the response when, when you say words, you don't know if they really get it because you can't see them? In medical teaching, you do that all the time. You see if they understand.
Yeah, well, I have to say absolutely, Jerry. You know, I'm used to talking to students and having at least, what should I say, some kind of ambient feedback, just a feeling of what's going on in the room. And I missed
We
that.
lost Charlie there.
Yeah. But
If you can see, Bob Primack here, if you can see the gallery view in some way, you get a little bit of a sense of how people are reacting, or if they're reacting.
But with
Yes.
MOOC, you don't have a gallery view like that, and people are taking courses, at 3 a.m. in the morning. We have a distinguished speaker series, and one of our speakers is a comedian. And we said we were going to be, muting everybody and stopping the video. And he said, you can't do that. How can I tell if my jokes go over?
right, you can watch the yawns.
The best MOOC that I ever took had a classroom with the professor. So he had some interaction, and as a watcher, I could see some interaction and how he interacted with the audience.
Well, let me go on and talk a little bit about that, because why take a MOOC? I think I add over here that, and this is very much my personal take on why taking MOOCs. But the very first MOOC, kind of making your point, the very first MOOC I ever took was this cryptography MOOC. Whoops. All right. Sorry, back up. I took a cryptography MOOC taught by Dan Bona at Stanford. I took it because I thought I'd like to know about cryptography, and I'd like to understand what protects my data and to what extent the data are protected. And I have to say, after many, many MOOCs, I still liked the simplicity of what he was doing, because first of all, it was Dan Bona. He had transparencies, and in fact, each transparency had become a slide, but then he would annotate those himself, and he would write on this as he lectured. He would write on it, and I thought that worked really well. If you look at edX, especially the edXs that have been made right from the start with edX in mind, everything is very rigid, really. They have a palette of software pieces that they can use, and they can ask multiple choice questions with one answer, or they can ask true and false, or they can do drag and drop. They have quite a few things, but it is a limited, and in the end, you don't have a sense of the great thing about the Lewin lectures, where you still had Walter Lewin's kind of persona there, which gave them the kind of vitality that after he was sent into the outer darkness, that vitality is not so present in the replacement courses. I did take some courses where I had some good sense of the professor. I took this Introduction to Philosophy course in Edinburgh. And I'll come back and talk about that in a second, because I got a nice story. I took the Dave Waite's Science of Cooking, as John did. I thought was terrific. I was taking these because I was interested. Now, electricity and magnetism and mechanics, I was not taking those because I was interested in the material. I've taught that material. I was taking it because I wanted to see how other people were teaching it in MOOCs. And to a very large extent, again, I think it's an important point, they were essentially translating their lecture method to the screen. There wasn't, I think there was a lack of utilization of the possibilities of online communication. I took Galois theory, and a kind of similar story to John taking some math course. I took this because, well, I knew that Galois was the one who was able to show, sort of the night before he got himself killed in a duel, he was able to show that fifth order polynomials and higher have no general solution. I thought, oh, I'd like to know about that. I couldn't do it. It was too hard. I just blew me away, and I had to go do something else. I did take a couple of courses which I thought I was inspired to take, because one of the features that showed up in looking at who was taking MIT and Harvard MOOCs was that at least the physics courses were being taken by a lot of Asians, Chinese, Taiwanese, Japanese, Southeast Asians, and and they clearly knew the physics. I mean, the physics, they didn't have any trouble with the physics. So I was puzzled, and they would drop out. I mean, they would take the course for a while and then drop out. And then I was talking with someone from Taiwan, and he said, that's obvious. They take it for the English. They're taking a course that they know the substance of in order to practice their English comprehension. I thought, that's a terrific idea. And so I went and I signed up for Electrичество и Magnetism in the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology, which is Moscow's answer to MIT. I'll say something more about that in a little bit. I took the Civil War triumvirate that John took from Eric Foner at Columbia. I have a fairly extensive background in history, and so it was a lot of fun to take these 3 courses. I must say, I was left with a sense that he, like many historians, was kind of pushing his material in the direction that if you just looked at what was actually happening on the ground at the time, kind of his overall interpretation was not fully supported by the very material he was presenting. But that's an argument between professors. Oh, done it again. I took a couple of things, as I say, because I wanted to know the material. I took numerical analysis because I took that, 50, 60 years ago. I liked it at the time. I understood it at the time. And there's an enormous pleasure in taking a course where you're not going to have to struggle to retain new material, but instead what you're going to have is your old material sort of revived. All right. So now I wanted to tell you 2 stories about the fun of taking MOOCs, at least in the humanities for me. And the first one was I took this philosophy MOOC, Introduction to Philosophy, University of Edinburgh. It had 7 different professors. The 7th professor, the last module of the course, was teaching about metaphysics. And he was saying the point of metaphysics is that it's the way you can talk about something without actually knowing anything about the thing itself. Or is the thing itself even real? There are still questions you can ask about it. And so he said, I have to give you an example. And the example that he gave us was time travel. He said, now, you don't know anything about time travel. We don't know if it's possible or not possible. We argue about that. But he said, here's a set of questions. Here's a way you can find yourself arguing about it. And in the course of this, he said, here's some movies on time travel. And so I'm going to share with you at least the 6 movies that came to me out of this course, because I did go and then ultimately watched all 6 movies, and I thought it was just great. I just had a wonderful time with those 6 movies. So here's Primer. Primer is a movie that was put together by a guy in the suburbs of Palo Alto somewhere, or at least on the West Coast. The story, there are 2 things about it. The story is a nifty story. It's about 4 guys working in their garage, kind of like the old origin myths of Apple. They're working in their garage, and they accidentally invent a time travel machine. And how do you take it from there? That's the story, and it's a fun story. It's an extremely complicated plot. It is so complicated that there are YouTube analyses of the plot, people trying to figure out if they understand it. The other thing about it is this is really a well-made, substantial movie made for, get this, $7,000. How can you do that? And the way you can do it is that the director was also the actor, was actually wrote the music, did some of the playing, and wrote the script, did all this kind of stuff. So that's very good. Another one is Cronocrímenes in Spanish. I watched it twice because the first time I got a copy of it, I didn't realize it was in Spanish until they started talking Spanish. My Spanish is minute. And so then I watched it again because I found a copy that had English subtitles. La Jetée is a very interesting movie. It's 28 minutes long. It's a movie made with mostly stills, but it's also the base plot for 12 Monkeys. And 12 Monkeys is a Bruce Willis film that was made and run theaters a few years back. Again, a plot of some complexity. That's part of the charm of time travel. Looper is another time travel, another Bruce Willis film. This one, the mob in the future is sending people that they want to get rid of back where there's a sort of a branch of the mob who kills, puts the victim's feet in a cement and throws them in the river. And of course, how are you going to prosecute the mob doing this 20 years in the future? And then there's The Time Traveler's Wife, which is another charming, it's an interesting book. And the idea is that the guy has some kind of genetic defect, which causes him to time travel erratically every now and then. And she's the one who's smart enough to figure out what's going on. So fun stories. And then the ancient Greek hero, Greg Nagy, that teaches this out of Harvard. You can read the book. You don't have to take the MOOC. But it left me thinking, is Ulysses, is he a psychopath? And I was interested in this question because because I had read an article in the New Yorker magazine, 2008, by a couple of guys, psychologists, who were developing an index of questions a set of questions to index the degree of psychopathy in prisoners. They were using it, testing it in New Mexico state prison system somewhere, where they had enabled them, they had been allowed to bring in an MRI so that you could ask your suspected psychopath various questions while he had his head all wrapped up for an MRI. And I thought that was very interesting. But I was interested in the 20 questions, one of a game. You rate it by 0 does not apply, 1 applies, 2 applies definitely. And then the highest score you can achieve is 40, 2 times 20. And if you rate over 30, you are considered to be psychopathic in the United States. And so I checked out Odysseus. He does mass murders. He lies all the time. He is sexually promiscuous. There's just all these kinds of questions. A little hard to deal with the question about whether he's breaking parole, but there are these questions. He clearly scores over 30. So I left the course saying, well, I've now had an insight into the Greek hero, at least this one. What about Achilles, you might say? Achilles comes in only around 20, in the 20s somewhere. In the UK, he might score as a psychopath, but I think he just has anger management problems, and we should understand that. I just wanted to mention taking Russian physics for the language. This was a hard course, and there's an introductory physics course, but they really put it to you. And ultimately, the passing grade was 35%. I did better than that, but I didn't do a lot better than that. That was kind of sobering. But in the end, I did well enough so that they said I had won a prize. Did I want my prize? I said, you bet. And then I forgot about it. And then about 3 months later, there appeared in my mail this battered package from Moscow containing 2 volumes of a high school physics textbook in Russian, written by S.M. Kozyel, who was the professor in our very definitely college-level course that we were taking online. So that was kind of cool. I just had to brag about that. So the next question is, what does it take to make a MOOC? And this is kind of what John put me on the program for, is to talk about this one. And it turns out it takes a lot. I mean, it really is a sobering enterprise when you're seeing it from the inside. When I saw that thing about education being free, he means for the receiver, but for the person who's producing it and producing it as a MOOC, it is far from free. That original Lewin physics course put on as a crash program out of MIT. That one, I think, cost somewhere around $900,000 to take an existing set of videos and put the edX wrapper around them. And just to do it, I wrote some programs, I did some work. Sort of one of the more useful applications of edX, in my mind, is they use it as a supplement to the 801 residential course now, an 802 residential course. So that makes a lot of sense to me because they can do at least a modified version of what's known as flipping the classroom, where you have your students do stuff outside of class, and you will know when they come to class that they have done the readings and that they have engaged with the material and now they have questions. And so you can spend a lot of your class time on the question. And that's probably very desirable. It has some other desirable features too, but I'm not going to go into those. Anyway, to write a problem, to go into the middle of one of these things, you have available over 20 software templates supplied by edX. I would write a problem with maybe 6, and that's the kind of thing of, is it multiple choice, is it drag and drop, or is there some kind of free response, or what's going on there? If you're going to do mathematics, you really need LaTeX. That's not a problem for me, but then you need some editor for LaTeX, so you need to know TeXworks. Then it's got to get to XML somehow, because that's what's going to be displayed. And so you need LaTeX to edX Python program that somebody has written to convert the LaTeX to XML. And then it turns out it doesn't do it all that well. So you've got to know enough Python so you can read the code and find where the quirks and anomalies are being put in. And you also need Python if you want to write scripts to add any flexibility and responsiveness to your program. And then you need some kind of editor that will handle XML and Python. You can't just use Microsoft Word, because Microsoft Word will put all kinds of stuff, control characters in that you don't want. And finally, you're going to need to know some XML, because you need to actually go in and modify the XML output. And if you want graphics or figures, you need someone of or more of SketchUp or MATLAB or screen capture. Even Excel is rather good graphics if you know how to use them. And you need to be able to fit all this stuff into the edX file structure. So you have to know the course file structure required by edX, and there are more than 10 specific files to which the components of the course have to be allocated. I think I was using 6. And then it turns out with a Mac, you can use Finder, but it's a lot easier if you just know some bash commands, so you can go right into the Unix and fix things there. And then, having put all this stuff together, it has to go into a test platform. And you're not going to run it out and release it to the world until you've gone through it and had it checked by people who know the physics. And for this, you need to have a virtual edX machine that will run on your own computer so that you can, again, see it. And then all the things have to go together, and you have to have some kind of software like Git and GitHub so that you can supply all the different components of your edX course to the central coordinator. And you can see emerging here something which I find disturbing. You see the shift away from the professor. You're getting into, it's getting to be like the movie industry. I mean, you have an actor, but you have to have a director, you have to have a lighting expert, you have to have somebody doing special effects, you have to have first grip, second grip, key grip, this grip, that grip, you have to have all this kind of stuff. You begin to have a staff which dwarfs the professor, and in fact, in the long run, you begin to wonder, well, what's he there for except to verify that the material is correct. It gets to be also the way making a large textbook has become. Again, the author begins to look quite small. And here, I'm going to skip this pretty much, just to mention that it turns out that if you talk to educational psychologists, and this is one from Stanford, they will tell you that a lot of the bells and whistles that people aspire to put into online learning, including simulations and games, they're actually counter-effective, or they're way more expensive than simpler ways of achieving the same degree of learning. And that you're also balked in some extent by the problem that faculty who will solve a problem with great insight are really only able to describe about 30% of what the details are as they sort their way through, using the conservation of energy to do this and that. And that if you're depending on students to tell you how much they've learned from the course, forget it. 50% of the students, when asked what and how much they learned, got it wrong, didn't know. This is all done with various educational testing that I don't know any of the details. Anyway, that just gives me the chance to say it doesn't have to be this complicated, and lets me present my hero or heroine, Madame Tu, Ms. Tu, Yaozhang Tu, teaches physics at Eleanor Roosevelt High School in Greenbelt, Maryland. And she has made here over 20 modules for her AP Physics course. And I thought they were pretty good. They run mechanics through E&M and all the way down the strap. I thought they were so good that even though the production values are crappy, I mean, they're grainy and lighting is not that wonderful, I got in touch with her and I said, how did you do this? And I got this, I thought, very nice reply. I use my 5-year-old Handycam. I use a lot of lights that hurt my eyes. I should have gotten a better camcorder because the video quality only looks good enough on a small screen. I do everything by myself. I use Microsoft's free version of the Windows Live Movie Maker for editing. It's very time consuming, although especially when it involves demonstrations. The point being that you can do this by yourself. You do not need to have this huge staff that edX requires, really. And I think there's a warning to us there. If the tools get better so that an individual can do this, then you may find yourself dealing with something which I think is a very important idea. I'm going to skip that for a minute because it plays into what is the future of MOOCs. And here I think an idea by Clayton Christensen is very important. He has talked about disruptive innovation. He died last January, but he was a professor of business at the Harvard Business School. And he developed this concept of disruptive innovation, in which he points out that if you come up with a new technology that's easy to use and affordable, cheaper than the old one, it will both open new markets, even if the quality is low, and as a result, it will start to undercut higher quality products. And he says this will happen especially if products, as they mostly do, evolve beyond their market's needs. And I'll give you one example. I'll give you two examples of evolving beyond their market's needs and getting wiped out. Sort of automobiles, I just went through this. I bought a 1998 Subaru Loyale. It was a tin can, it rusted out, it was kind of a crappy car. It met my needs nicely, and it was cheap. But I wasn't going to buy another one until I read that they had fixed a lot of things. So in 2003, I bought one, bought a Subaru Forester. It was a great car. It didn't get great gas mileage, but it lasted. It never showed a spot of rust over the 17 years that I owned it. And then so I thought, I'm going to get another. And I got another. I drove it home from Herb Chambers Honda. And by the time I got home, about a 10-minute drive, I was saying to myself, I hate this car. It's just an awful car. And then I sat down and read the manual. It was an awful car because it was just, it was just sort of full of crappy things I didn't need. And so I was very sensitive to Clayton Christensen's indictment of, or not indictment, he just said that's what happens. You start with the Toyota Corolla and eventually you're going to end up making, Lexus or Acura. So I took my car back and got a Honda Fit, which really meets my needs very nicely. But here's an even more example, even more familiar to you. The camera iPhones, camera, the old Nikon, beautiful, good lenses and all that kind of stuff, gets really trashed by the introduction of digital cameras, which are so much more convenient, and they're cheaper. And then, of course, the digital cameras get trashed again by iPhones, where, again, the quality is not that great, but the convenience is tremendous, and it opens up a new market. So this kind of thing, it gets summarized in this graph that I'm not going to explain to you unless you ask me any questions later. But I'm going to conclude by saying that my take on the future of MOOCs is that they're fun, but there is no business model, so you should take one while there's still time, because there's going to have to be some way of paying back the cost of making these things. I think, again, this question that Jerry brought up, I think big changes are coming to education, because I think education is an example of the kind of thing Clayton Christensen's talking about, of adding ever more features to the product until it has so many features, including athletic programs and social programs and health programs and job finding support programs and psychological support programs. I mean, I saw all that stuff come in at Colgate in my 36 years there. And all of these features get added and added and added. And at some point, something is going to come in at the bottom that's a lot cheaper. And it may very well be MOOCs. It just won't be MOOCs in the form that they're in right now. Because I think the MOOC right now is like the horseless carriage. The first internal combustion engines were just put onto a carriage from which the horse had been removed. And you had to have brakes, and you had to have a steering mechanism. But it still looked a lot like a horseless carriage. I think today's MOOCs are, to a very large extent, the horseless carriages. They're just lectures that have been brought over onto line, and they're now being kind of decorated with useful or maybe not so useful things like the quizzes and the questions. There are big unanswered questions about the education. There's the question of certification and authentication. Quality assurance probably not so serious, but this is where your monopoly of the universities is retaining control, and that will be attacked almost certainly one way or another. And so I think you're going to see some serious inroads in the business model of higher education, and not MOOCs are going to make that inroad, but their successors, the iPhone model of MOOCs. And I think that may mean that there's some big opportunities for teachers of all kinds in high schools and community colleges to make this stuff, to go put it online. So
that's why the changes today with all the Zoom courses that happened because of the pandemic may be that middle road. The people who teach a class utilizing Zoom are not going through hundreds of thousands of dollars of creative teaching software and people helping them and the grips coming in. They're just teaching the class as if they would normally teach it. But of course, they're teaching it to a group of maybe 25 students. They're not putting it up online so that 100,000 can do it whenever they feel like it from wherever they are on the globe.
Absolutely right, John. And that's where I end with making that point. And so we can talk about that, I think.
John, you're right, but the quality of the coursework, because they are untrained, because they are newbies, if you will, is suspect. I don't know how kids are truly learning today in public education. MOOCs are very sophisticated. What we have today with the Zoom classes is far less than sophistication.
But you get into what does something cost? In other words, if you can get something that's 60% for $1.50 or 90% for $100,000, you got to ask yourself what you're going to settle for.
Well, there's an old adage that I think still applies. There's no such thing as a free lunch.
Well, of course, that's been the claim that MOOCs are free lunch for us consumers of MOOCs, but it can't go on.
So,
Charlie,
what's the economics behind that? Why would somebody like Colgate or any other at the school invest $1 million, 900,000, pick a number, in this and then give it away for free, even though they get 100,000 people to attend the course? Where's the ROI?
That's exactly my point, Peter.
I think I can answer one thing. It's a recruiting tool for the offline courses.
That is true. That's a good point, Bob. But for that, it's you do not need to make. Well, there's already an extensive investment in recruiting videos, so this would be just a marginal increase in that cost.
Charlie, there is a mystique about the connections between teachers and students. You know, this sort of mystical communication, which in some cases is true, in many cases it isn't, but it's sort of at the heart of most teachers to establish that. What is your comment on that quality of education?
Well, I think I include that in this grouping of trying to create a social community around your material. You know, that is to have a class in which you can sort of build interaction among the students and with you and you with them. That's an enormous pleasure, and I think it has a huge educational benefit. And in some ways, that's again this distinction that I tried to make earlier between naive learners and experienced learners. That is, part of classroom involvement is most needed where the students are new to learning. They have not yet learned how to learn on their own. And so you're providing emotional support, among other things, but and a kind of trying to jolly them through this stuff. So I think, you know, I taught 36 years in a liberal arts college, and it still shocks me to see at MIT sort of the distance between the professor and the students. Peter Dermashkin once was enthusiastically telling me about how these students had been so excited to actually talk with the professor personally. Try to stop my students from talking.
Yeah.
Hey, Charlie, to Dan's point, is there a difference in the interactions between undergraduate level students and graduate level students, and how it applies to MOOC?
Well, I mean, the graduate student education is very much an apprenticeship. I mean, it's a much smaller volume. If I understand your question, I mean, you know, a major professor is going to have, I don't know, 15 students would be a huge number at one time at various levels working on their degree. They are a tight, they knit social group. They're reinforcing each other, supporting each other. That's actually that's a wonderful experience. I remember my PhD work in nuclear physics with great pleasure. I mean, it was hard, but hard physically, hard. You were tired at the end of your 15-hour day.
Yes, but Peter's question also could be applied to the first 2 to 3 years of graduate.
I'm not. Can you get more volume?
Yeah, Peter's question could be applied to the first 2 or 3 years of graduate school, however, which is not really apprenticeship.
Well, that's certainly true, but it was I remember it as we were people who had gone to graduate school because we were capable, at least at some minimum level, and we were engaged in a kind of common mission, even if we were in the courses together. So it was socially supportive, and that was part of its pleasure. You were working hard. You were working hard. You were working hard on your own, but you were there side by side with other people. Also, at least in my situation, my second year. By the second year, I was a TA, and that's again a different social experience. Now, graduate work, to my mind, well, as an undergraduate, what I remember is the social pleasure of dealing with other undergraduates. But I was in big classes, but my professors were never distant. If I wanted to talk to a professor, I could talk to a professor, and they seemed happy to see me.
I think you touched on a very key phrase, socially supportive. I think that is the huge gap that MOOCs and distance learning and other paradigms really don't address. You know, and that's a really, really big deal.
The question that I have, well, first let me do the prologue, which is the graduate experience truly was an apprenticeship in my case. I'm a historian, and I'm in touch with almost all the faculty I actually worked with, and many others who I went to for advice over the course of a graduate career. So it really was an apprenticeship, but it was also about eventual inclusion in the association, if you will, or in the fraternity. And it was truly one of the most transformative experiences. Like Charlie, I had an experience at a large state university, not a private one, but at a large state university, where I had huge classes, and I never felt inhibited from going up and having extensive conversations at any time, office hours or not, with faculty. It was a very open environment. The question that I have is, and this comes out of my own experience teaching at a small school, relatively small now, well, I guess medium-sized now, at Bentley, and where students will write me 10 years later to remind me of how I presented a subject that has now entered into the press, entered into discussion again, and to either say, yes, you were so right, or you got that one wrong. But the question I have about the MOOC is how much of MOOC learning is eventually understood by the students who are engaged, and is there any way that that has been measured so that the kind of thing that I'm describing, where a student will say, I finally get what you were saying, or I've come to disagree even more, becomes part of that reality. And is there any way that has been measured?
I don't know. I don't know that. I mean, it could be, but
I sort of doubt that there's a lot that continues, but because especially if so many people are dropping out, they're discontinuing the entire MOOC experience for a particular course, so they don't get to have that.
Let me make a point about that dropping out thing. That is to some extent an artifact, and to a large extent an artifact of the way the MOOCs are set up. You cannot find out what the content of a MOOC is going to be unless you register for it. So you sign, you register, and you say, oh no, I don't want that, and you're out. And right away you've gone from 27,000 or 40,000 registrants down to 20,000 registrants. And then those 20,000, some of them look at the first 2 or 3 sessions and try some of the homework and say, nah, not for me, and they're gone. And so you come down to the end. There's the shrinkage, which looks so, this 5% thing. It isn't even. It's much better than what do I want to say.
Charlie, that's like you buying the Subaru.
Yeah. Well, that's a different issue, I think.
However, I think that there are different kinds of people dropping it. There are the people that you described that found out that the course wasn't what they thought they were signing up for. But then there are people who want to understand something about an area that they know little about. So with me at the time, signing up for artificial intelligence, say, was that. And well, the DNA one is a better example, the biology one. And by the time I took about half that course, I learned what I really wanted to learn. I didn't want to become an expert in it. And so it was very fulfilling to me. After about half of it, I felt comfortable dropping out. I suspect there are people who are like that.
Yeah. I would like to add to that my own experience. I mean, I completed probably half of the courses that I took, which is way above normal. But I haven't taken any for quite a while. And the reason is they're a huge amount of work, you know? And I mean, at one point I suddenly said to myself, you know, I got to get a life. I mean, I'm getting so much into this. I gotta quit. And it was sort of like saying, you know, I can take it or leave it alone, and then finding out, well, I really couldn't leave it alone. So I had to go cold turkey and get off the MOOCs.
I'd
Charlie,
like to
that was my
agree totally with this notion that a 13-week or whatever the length of a semester is the proper length for online learning. I think somehow we're going to have to figure, I mean, this stuff is only going to be useful, I think, in the long term if it's made in smaller bites that you can chunk off, and especially for people our age. Now, of course, if we're saying kids coming out of high school, yeah, maybe that's something different. But for us to be judging the effectiveness of these online classes for them is a little questionable in my mind. You know, we should be taking surveys of kids in there from 18 to 25 as to what they think of them.
That's why you come back to why you're taking it. If you're merely trying to be a little bit more knowledgeable about an area, like the typical retiree is, then your goals are very different than a 32-year-old Raytheon software engineer who finds out that he's not getting his next promotion because his boss thinks that he hasn't gone off to learn whatever the newest computer language or paradigm is. And so he takes these courses to gain proficiency. And now that person probably wants every bit of testing that he can get, writing programs and all, so that he can demonstrate to his boss that he's got that skill.
Yeah, I think that's true. And someone who was already done a lot of learning is probably, you know, in your 32-year-old example, doesn't need quite as much nurturing as an 18 to 25-year-old kid who's never experienced some of this stuff before.
Right. That's very true. In what
The other point, which I think is implicit in what Harry is saying, is, yeah, my attention span is narrowing. I'm getting old, and I can tell, and I don't like it, but there it is.
We all are, Charlie.
Yeah, we all are. And we're getting more anxious, too, at our old age. But
We're wondering whether it's lunchtime yet.
Yeah.
Can I ask a
one
question for Dick Wagner, please?
Yeah.
His mic is not working, and he's trying desperately. So, Dick, I'm going to try to read your question, and hopefully I get it right, and give me a thumbs up if I do okay. He says, from an education psychology perspective, are there differences from in-person versus online learning? From my experience from teaching and learning, I believe there is. Can you all comment, or at least comment?
Okay.
Thumbs up, we're good.
I can give you an anecdote. I was at Stanford in the early 60s, and late 60s. And there was a course in computer science before there was even such a field. It was just barely formed. And they had a lecture by some guy, very talented guy, talking about computer languages in a general way. And if you got to the classroom in time, there was a seat. If you didn't get to the classroom in time, you had to go to the overflow room where you would see the guy on TV. And what immediately showed up was that people would come and find that they were going to have to go to the overflow room, and they'd just go home. You know, the hell with this. I'm not going to sit and watch some guy on TV. So there, I think you get even the difference between a human being who's, you know, whom you can smell, who's down there.
Well, it
But
depends.
I'll give you the other view of that. I'm at a point now, and have been since I retired, where I want a lot of these classes and I can't get to the places where those classes would be available to me. So I look at this online stuff as a wonderful alternative to not having anything, or basically having a book. Now, I've signed up for the courses at Brandeis. Those things, of course, are well, until recently, were in person. But I've taken the courses online because if I want a course on the Civil War from a recognized expert like Foner, I don't have a lot of choices, and taking it online is good. And I considered the course to be good. And of the 20 MOOCs that I took, I would say all of them were good, and 2 of them were too complicated for me, so I basically dropped out. But that was my fault, not their fault.
Dan, why don't you go ahead?
Charlie, do you think that young people will continue to be attracted to lives in academia as teachers when the education becomes so depersonalized?
Well, that's a good, I don't know quite how to answer it. What I would suspect will happen is that there will be sort of little groups where you can go and, I don't know, sit at the feet of, or anyway, interact personally with an instructor in a subject. You know, that'll become the elite, most expensive, most desirable thing to do. It'll be like having the best automobile or something like that. You know, it won't be what the masses get, but it will continue to be around, and it won't need as many professors probably. Mm-hmm. But I think that would
be like going to Metropolitan Opera.
You're breaking up, Dan. I didn't hear.
I was saying it sounds like going to the Metropolitan Opera, where you pay huge prices, but you're hearing the person really.
Oh, I thought we were going to go up to the AMC and watch them online.
Yeah, the HD is not bad, actually. Yeah. You know, one thing you guys didn't talk about, which I find interesting and I've personally experienced, is an organization called One Day University. And it's sort of a compromise between a MOOC. I see some people nodding. It's a compromise between a MOOC and, you know, and a Bali course or a brown bag lecture. And that now with the online version, for a small fee, you get their whole catalog pretty much open, and they have individual lectures. So it's a couple hour lectures about a specific subject by people who are, in general, in my experience, really good. And Harry nodded, so I think he may have some experience too in this. It's really good. I've taken them live, and I haven't taken the online ones yet.
What's the name again?
One Day University. They advertise in the Globe a fair amount and a whole bunch. I think it's about $8 or $10 or a month or something like that. For Harry, what do you think? What do you remember?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And you know, the other thing is, your university may in fact hold a set of these things. I know that Yale is now blossoming with, you know, not even just one day, maybe just a 2-hour lecture on some current topic. So there's this continuum beginning to happen of online, from the 1-hour lecture to the 13-week course. And I think it's, who knows where this is all going to settle out, where the right spot is. But I certainly know that I'm not going to go to the library at 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in the middle of winter to listen to somebody speak in that wonderful spot they have. I'd much prefer to see it on my screen from the comfort of my home. And I don't think people are going to go back to...
Don't tell George that.
Say what?
Don't tell George Burnell that.
Sorry, George.
Well, you got a good point. You know, there's this cool program, College for Older Learners, and some of the state schools have it. Well, I've gone to them. As a matter of fact, when I gave my 1.5-hour talk on nuclear power generation, I was preparing a 6-hour course, you know, for the general public on nuclear power, you know, the theory, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, the big issue with nuclear power is it safe, you know, because I worked in it for 4 years, but being an electronic engineer and studying nuclear power at Lowell Tech, now University of Lowell, you know, my background was such I could talk about it. But I will say this, it was that to see how the people are reacting is really cool, because if you start talking math, you know, you don't know what the other guy took. They could be a psychologist or something like that, or an archaeologist, nothing to do with what the subject you're talking about. So that human interface is really important.
Have we killed it?
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody. Charlie, thank you.
You bet.
Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you. Be safe.
Okay, that's lunch.
Thank you.